Good morning. We are in chapter 17 of the story, over halfway through this series. That sounds weird to say, 17 weeks deep to be at the halfway point, but that's where we are. And I have enjoyed talking with you as you have read through, and I pray that you have been faithful to your reading and pray that you would continue to be, because you have systematically been working your way through the Old Testament, as we all have. And it's just been a neat thing for so many of us to really establish and reestablish that foundation that brings us to the New Testament that we preach from so often. And today, as we unpack chapter 17 of the story, we're in the book of Jeremiah. So now you're getting on to the midway point and just past it in your Bible. So if you'd like to turn to Jeremiah chapter 2, that is where we are firmly going to plant ourselves today. So again, that's in the Old Testament, Jeremiah chapter 2. And the story has been helping us identify where everything fits and how everything fits. And now we're really starting to see how everything in the story points to the main character. His name is Jesus. I hope you know him. Have you ever had a moment, I think we have lots of moments like this, where it feels like the water is rushing through where it does not belong, and you're trying desperately to stop it, but there's just nothing you can do? If anybody has ever been a part of the sad misfortune of having your basement flood, even a little bit, and that water's coming in where it doesn't belong, and you're trying to identify how and where it's coming in, and you're trying to stop it or contain it or just scoop it up before it does too much damage, and you know the anxiety and the panic that brings. And really, all you can do is hopelessly watch it flow in and realize that there really just isn't a lot you can do to stop it. And sometimes that's how I feel, and I think a lot of us feel that way, even as we see the spiritual decline of our nation and how we just move further and further away from God to a point where there really is no structural dependence or even acknowledgement, not a proper acknowledgement of Him in our country. And you just see this spiritual decline advancing more and more. And over my lifetime and over your lifetime, we've seen the tear in the fabric of society. As far as it depends on God, it just gets bigger and bigger, and it seems like more water rushes out. And the truth is that as we look around at how things progress, it just leaves us feeling like there just isn't a lot of hope that things will repair or lessen or turn around. And maybe that's how you feel about some element in your life. Maybe it's how you feel about your marriage. You started out well and enthusiastic and in love, but then struggle came and bad situations came. And, you know, at first you could just kind of patch things up and sew things up, but then eventually you find yourself putting patches on top of patches. And it just seems that no matter how much you sew on, that water is still getting out. And the level keeps dropping. Maybe it's your kids. You've invested in the way that you thought you should invest, and you make the choices that you think that you should make. And we always do our best with the information that we have at the time and the wisdom that we think is best at the time. And the thing is with kids, with so many things in life, is you can do everything wrong and have things turn out right, and you can do everything right and have things turn out wrong. But you just look at maybe choices that they're making or paths that they're taking, and it becomes disheartening. Maybe it's your finances. Maybe you, again, did the best you could with the information that you had, but the way that you were set up, but there was just some things that didn't turn out the way that you thought that they might. Maybe you bought that house or you bought that car at the wrong time, or maybe you didn't buy that house or you didn't get that car or you didn't make that purchase, and maybe looking back you should have. It's just so hard to know. But whatever it is, maybe that you've put your hope in something and it's sprung a leak and you try to fix it, but you can't. It's the image of idolatry in the Old Testament. Yeah, we're talking about it again. It's hope that is placed in something other than God. It's hope placed where it does not belong, and then we just watch that hope leak out, or maybe even flow out. And really, since Easter, we've been in this kingdom talk. We've talked about God's kingdom and these kingdoms in the north and the south of Israel and Judah. We're talking 200 plus years, and God sends all these prophets. We have Elijah, prolific Elijah. We talked about Hosea, the writing prophet Isaiah, and now to the weeping prophet Jeremiah. There was 9 different prophets that were sent to God's kingdom over 200 years to tell them, you have to turn. You have to turn back to God, because destruction is coming if you don't. It's not going to go well. We've talked about warnings and warning lights. And sometimes you feel like you've been warned about things several times in the same area over a period of time, but not 200 years. 200 years of different prophets and warnings that come. We looked at the fall of the northern kingdom, and we saw how God had withheld His judgment on the southern kingdom because of Hezekiah, the king of purity and prayer. But after him comes Manasseh. And it says that refrain that we've heard so many times, that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he brings back the idols and the idolatry, stupidity. He even sacrifices his own son to an idol, burned alive. Can you imagine? God's had enough. 200 years deep, He's had enough. And so He allows the Babylonians with their king Nebuchadnezzar. They come in with their army and attack Judah. And for so long, God's people defied the odds against these large armies because God was fighting with them. Well, not this time. And so we see these different sieges that come about in 586 BC. Jerusalem falls, the temple is destroyed, and God's people are exiled and they're dispersed, except for a small remnant that remain. And among them is this prophet Jeremiah. And his job is to preach and plead with these people who won't listen. We've talked about this gig of being a prophet. You didn't want it. And it's funny, you know, we look at these different writings of the prophets and these heroes of the Bible, and they are really. But we kind of romanticize the things that they say to inspire us and maybe sometimes pull away from what was actually happening. You look at Isaiah. You look at Isaiah, and you see it's been quoted so many times, you know, when he's before the Lord and there's this ministry to be called to, and Isaiah says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." And you can hear that in a song, or you could print it on a t-shirt or put it on your coffee mug, and it sounds good. Here I am, Lord, send me. Well, he was sent. In fact, he was sent to preach his whole life to a people that would never respond to his message. Here I am, Send me. Jeremiah, he was the same. His job was to continue to preach to people that won't listen. You ever try to reason with someone who just will not listen? Not even just that they won't hear you, but they just won't listen to you and what you have to say at all. And God even tells him that the people are not going to listen. And they don't. But understand the heart of Jeremiah. Again, sometimes he's called the weeping prophet or the whining prophet. I would call him the pleading prophet. See, you're going to understand his message. As he comes before these people, he's warning them of destruction. He's not coming at them with hellfire and brimstone. It's not turn or burn, baby. He's begging them. He is so saddened by what is happening and what will come to pass that he's begging them. He's pleading with them to turn back. He knows what's coming. They won't listen. Last week, we talked about Hezekiah and what brings God's blessing. Well, today in Jeremiah, we see what brings God's wrath. And that's why it's so important that we have been systematically going through the Old Testament, and why it's so important that you have this foundation and this understanding of who God is in the Old Testament, because until you know and understand the God of wrath, you cannot understand or appreciate the God of love. We teach and preach so much about this God of love in the New Testament, and we should. But you have to understand the foundation of this God of wrath, because he's the same God. Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 9 through 13 says, "Therefore I bring charges against you again, declares the Lord, and I will bring charges against your children's children. Cross over to the coasts of Cyprus and look to Kedar and observe closely. See if there has ever been anything like this. Has a nation ever changed its gods, yet they are no gods at all? But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water," remember that, "and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." In the past several weeks, we've seen how God speaks through his prophets, and we see how his people respond or don't respond. And then he kind of summarizes the two sins. We've talked about them a lot. First, they have rejected God, "Have no other gods before me," and they have turned to idols, "No idols." And notice in Jeremiah, as we've seen with the other prophets, that he uses idolatry as the umbrella under which all other sins live. In the Old Testament, idolatry was always the tree from which sin grows. You see, idolatry was not a sin, it was the sin that all other sins fall under. We sit and we say, "Oh, I don't struggle with idolatry." Yes, you do. Lust is idolatry. Materialism is idolatry. Anxiousness and worry, idolatry. Where do you go to quench your thirst? Where do you find comfort, satisfaction, fulfillment? Jeremiah's metaphor helps us understand the idolatry that exists in our own lives. Idolatry is when we look to something or someone else for what only God provides. You read this passage in Jeremiah 2, and we see the imagery of a cistern. Cistern, just a big, it's kind of like a well. It's a big pit full of water. And they were an important part of everyday life in Israel at that time. And there's thousands of them that have been uncovered by archaeologists because rain was infrequent for half of the year. People would dig these big cisterns and they would line them with bricks and plaster and whatever they could conceive of that would hold the water. That was so important. But it was very common to have this problem that the cisterns would crack and they would break. And even when they worked well, they're just holding still water. And if you know anything about still water, is it becomes stagnant. And even just as a water supply, even full still water would just be wholly inadequate. And so this metaphor that Jeremiah uses in the passage would be very familiar for them, but don't miss how ridiculous this sounds, that he says that they are drawing stagnant water from broken cisterns instead of relying on the living water that is right beside them. They're filling broken cisterns, scooping out stagnant water, and right beside them is fresh, flowing spring water. And we do it. We choose that broken cistern to hold the water, and we draw out that stagnant water when that source of fresh and living water is right beside us, flowing up within us, in fact. It's idolatry. It's leaning on the thing that you have made rather than God who has given it. Instead of looking to God for comfort, we turn to food. Or instead of looking to God for significance, you turn to your career. Instead of looking to God for security, we turn to money. Instead of looking to God for joy, we put that burden on our spouses or our children. Instead of looking to God for hope, we turn to politicians. Instead of looking to God for truth, we look to social consensus. So many of these things are not bad of their own, but they don't sit in God's seat. And when they do, they're a big problem. And so the imagery that we see from these cisterns in the text is one of idolatry. And so the question is for me and for you this morning is, are you drinking from cisterns? Are you trying to get your living water from broken, stagnant cisterns? And here's a few signs that you might be. One is that you're just worn out from digging. I don't know if you've ever done any hole digging. It's not super fun. It's exhausting. And God makes a point to say, you have dug for yourselves. You're exhausting yourself on something that's going nowhere. When I was probably about, 14 or 15 years old, the house that we lived in, there was an issue with the septic tank or something. We didn't get a lot of extra details other than we were going to dig a hole. My brother and I and my father. And the good thing is that Dad knew approximately where the septic tank was that we were going to dig for. And so we spent a Saturday digging this huge hole. I don't remember how big it was. I know down in it, it was taller than me. And how wide, I probably have an exaggerated memory of how wide and long it was, but it was a big hole, and we dug all day, and we didn't find it. I don't know if it would have stunk more if we found it. But you dig all day and you're exhausted. I mean, completely spent. You show up to school on Monday just completely exhausted. What did you do on the weekend? You dug a big hole. And we filled it back in. People had to dig these all the time. They were exhausted. You had to. You had to dig and dig. It was exhausting. It was a tiring way to live. To dig a broken cistern that may not hold the water anyway, and if it did hold the water, it was gross. Solomon had a phrase for that. He called it chasing the wind. Pointless, meaningless, striving for something that will not satisfy. If you're finding yourself exhausted and striving, it's a sign of a broken cistern. Here's another sign. It's that bitter aftertaste of that stagnant water. Again, it's still water. It's gross. It's not good. Further down, still in Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 19 says, "Your wickedness will punish you. Your backsliding will rebuke you." See, outside of God's wrath, there's these passive, natural consequences of things in life. He says, "Consider and realize how evil and bitter it is for you when you forsake the Lord your God and have no awe of me, declares the Lord Almighty." And again, when we draw from that gross, stagnant water, we just reap what that is. We just sow a bunch of foolishness and then we reap it. You've often heard me phrase it as we play stupid games, we win stupid prizes. And I'm not preaching karma to you. I'm just saying there's a natural order of things. That's just part of how life is set up. When sin enters, and so too does suffering. And you could stick your hand in a fire and it would burn you. And you could say, is that right or is that wrong? That's just how it is. But it is funny how God has a natural order of things, that when we do goofy things, that goofy things happen to us. You've probably heard me tell the story before, but I tell my stories over and over, so here we go. A story that we love to tell from my father's childhood, where childhood friends of his, he says he wasn't involved, were out trick-or-treating. And they were into both the treats and the tricks. So you'd go get your candy, and then you'd snoop around to see what maybe else you could get into. And so they had happened upon a shed that the door was unlocked, and as soon as they opened the door, just inside was a bottle of pop, 2-liter bottle of pop of Pepsi. And so they grab it and make off with it, not very far before, they're wrestling one another over who is going to get the first drink. And so they spin off the top, whoever it was that came out on top, and he wraps his lips around it, and he pulls it back, and then leans forward and is immediately violently ill. And not just because it was Pepsi instead of Coke. Some of you are offended by that. Because it was used motor oil. Okay? That's what was inside of there. Okay? Was used motor oil. And what he thought was just going to be awesome and great and just better than you could even imagine for a young kid who happened upon a big bottle of pop. And it just supplied nothing but sickness and pain and embarrassment and just every bad thing. It did not provide what he hoped it would provide. And there is just this bitter aftertaste when you strive after things that are not good for you. And it's hard to watch when you see people make these goofy decisions and then they reap the consequences. It's actually heartbreaking. You think of Hezekiah in Proverbs 25:1, it says, "These are the Proverbs of Solomon, compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah." Remember we talked about Hezekiah, how he turned back to the Lord. Hezekiah was a father. We've talked about his son Manasseh. It's hard to watch those that come after you turn away. Hezekiah had turned the kingdom, and then Manasseh, his son, comes after it and fouls it all up. Does not follow. And, certainly we would think that Hezekiah deeply wanted for his son that, not just as a successor, but as a son to follow the Lord. It's hard. I started my ministry career here just volunteering in 2002, but very much in the mix of leading things in youth ministry, 2003, 2004. And man, I've dealt with a lot of kids. At different points in the youth ministry here, when I was leading a youth group, we had nights where we had 50 kids here worshiping together. Took a group of almost 20 kids to Pennsylvania to worship and grow together. I've spent time driving and getting coffee, sitting with kids, rescuing them from stupidity in some instances. Spent a lot of time with a lot of kids. You do camps, you do conferences, you do youth groups, and all the drives in between. What they don't tell you about youth ministry is that the numbers are so severely stacked against you. 85, 90+%. They don't stay. It's hard to watch because you love them. And so this is where you feel the heart of Jeremiah. He pleads with them. He pleads for them. Not because he wants them to do what he wants them to do, or because he would have his preference, or wants them to stay out of trouble, but because he wants them to connect with the Lord in that way. And it's hard. Here's another one. Is that your thirst is never truly quenched when you reach for these broken cisterns and this stagnant water. Where do you go to quench your thirst? Where do you find satisfaction and fulfillment? Again, Jeremiah uses this metaphor to help us see and picture the idolatry in our own lives. Because idolatry is when we look to something or someone to provide us with what only God can provide. Where we're reaching into these stagnant cisterns instead of drawing on living water, which is Jesus. Remember when Jesus introduced himself as the living water to the woman at the well? John chapter 4. When he meets this woman in the heat of the day at the well. She is a moral, relational, and spiritual failure. We see she's there in the middle of the day because she's so immoral, the other women won't be seen with her. And so she has to go in the middle of the day. Relational? Jesus says, you are right when you say that you have no husband. The truth is that you have had 5 husbands, and the man you are with now is not your husband. Spiritually, I'll tell you one thing. If you weren't welcome at the well, you weren't welcome at the temple. And so here is this complete wreck. And yet God reveals himself to her. And Jesus not only engages her, he pursues her. He wants her. He wants to love her. He wants to save her. and warn her from what's coming. And let her know that she can come back. And I want to remind you that you can come back. But this morning, my heart is way more with Jeremiah and those of you who identify with that longing and that pleading for the prodigal that you know, or the prodigal that you raised. I want to finish by reading an open letter that I knew was a bad idea when I put it in here. It's called My Dear Prodigal. A mother to a son. Oh, rats. This is why they call him the weeping prophet, by the way. My dear prodigal, I remember a boy who was so eager to call me mom, who gave me spontaneous hugs and kisses. You loved to eat all my food and made me feel like the best cook in the world. I remember your stubbornness and hoped you would use it to change the world, but instead you've used it to change mine and so many others who love you. And our hearts ache because we miss you, the real you, the one who was strong for the weak and made everyone feel safe. I can't help but wonder if I'm somehow to blame for the changes that you've made as of late. Was I too strict? Was I not strict enough? Did I show you the love and the grace that is Jesus, or was I a hypocrite? These questions plague my mind in torment, and then I know I'm not abiding in love because there is no fear in love. Then I start to figure out what I would do differently if I had the chance. Would I affirm you more? Would I correct you less? Would I discipline and guide you more gently? And I realize I'm trying to rewrite the past, something that can never be done, no matter how hard I try. And I remember that I am to forget those things which are left behind. Next, I start to wonder and worry about where you are and what you're doing and who you're with. And I stare at the glow of the digital alarm clock in my room and just wonder why you aren't answering your phone or your texts. But here the Comforter draws near and whispers that I'm to be anxious for nothing. You see, my dear child, you don't belong to me, and you never have. Your mom and your father gave you back to God. He has a plan for your future, and He finishes what He has started. And so this letter I write that you may never see, I pray that you know this one very important thing. I pray you know that my arms are wide open. They're ready for your return anytime you're ready, no matter what you've done. We'll face it together because His arms are ready too, you know. He awaits. He'll be dancing and spinning and celebrating with the best of them. He misses you more than I do. He paid a great price to know you. And every day your way seems like an eternity, so make haste, my son. We're waiting. Dad, Jesus, and I, fattening the calf, preparing for the party. We are standing in the yard, shielding our eyes from the sun, hoping to catch a glimpse of you coming over the horizon. That day cannot come soon enough. Arms always open. Mom. If you want to come back, His arms are open. But I'm telling you,
that for those of us here, and I know that you're here, I feel what you feel, and I long the way you long, and so does he. And I plead with you to keep pleading. Keep pleading before the Lord. Keep loving and reaching for your prodigal, that they would turn. Be faithful. He is faithful. Let's pray together.